Bing Crosby shouldn't have been at the Copacabana that night. He'd almost canceled the dinner reservation 3 times. But there he was, March 18, 1947, sitting alone when the shouting started. The entire nightclub went silent. At a corner table, 3 men in dark suits were standing, hands moving toward their jackets. Bing knew what came next. Everyone did. That's when he did something that shocked every mobster in New York. He walked straight toward them, cleared his throat, and said 5 words that stopped everything. It was a Tuesday evening, and the Copacabana was in full swing. The legendary nightclub at 10 East 60th Street in Manhattan was the place to be seen in 1947. Celebrities, politicians, and New York's underworld elite all mingled under the same roof, separated only by the invisible lines of respect and territory that kept the peace. Bing had come to New York for a radio broadcast and had planned to fly back to Los Angeles that same evening. But his sound engineer, a man named Eddie Sullivan, had begged him to stay one more night. "Mr. Crosby, my daughter's getting married tomorrow, and it would mean the world if you could just stop by the reception for 5 minutes. Bing had agreed, which meant he needed somewhere to have dinner first. The Copacabana wasn't his usual choice. Bing preferred quieter establishments, but his regular spot was closed for renovations. His driver had suggested the Copa, and Bing, tired from the broadcast, had simply agreed. He was seated at a small table near the back, away from the main floor where couples danced to the live band. The owner, Jules Podale, had personally ensured Bing had privacy and a good view of the stage. What Podale didn't mention was that table 7, just 10 feet from where Bing sat, had been reserved by some very particular clientele. Bing had ordered the veal and was reading through some sheet music for an upcoming recording session when the first voices caught his attention. They were low at first, the kind of conversation meant to stay private in a crowded room. But as the minutes passed, the voices grew louder, more insistent. "You're making a serious mistake, Tommy." The voice was calm, but there was steel underneath it. "Mr. Costello doesn't forget these things, and neither do we." Bing looked up from his sheet music. At table 7, 3 men sat in a configuration he recognized from his years performing in establishments like this. 2 men on one side, their backs to the wall, eyes scanning the room. 1 man sitting alone on the other side, facing them. The man sitting alone was sweating despite the air conditioning, his hands shaking as he tried to light a cigarette. "I told you I need more time," the lone man said, his voice breaking slightly. "The shipment got delayed. It wasn't my fault. The dock workers aren't our concern, Tommy. Your promises are. You said March 15th. It's March 18th. That's 3 days of Mr. Costello's money sitting somewhere it shouldn't be." Bing felt his chest tighten. He knew that name. Everyone in New York knew that name. Frank Costello, the Prime Minister of the Underworld, controlled more of New York's infrastructure than the mayor did. And these men at table 7 weren't just collectors. They were problem solvers. The man called Tommy was now visibly trembling. "Please, I have a family. My son, he's graduating next week from 48 hours. One of the men interrupted, his hand moving inside his jacket in a gesture that made several nearby tables go quiet. "You got 48 hours, or your kid don't make it to graduation." That's when Bing heard it clearly, the sentence that changed everything. The Copacabana, despite its 300 patrons, had gone almost silent. The band was still playing, but the conversation had stopped at every table within earshot. People were looking down at their plates, suddenly very interested in their food. This was the unspoken rule of places like the Copa. You saw nothing, you heard nothing, you remembered nothing. But Bing Crosby wasn't wired that way. He'd grown up in Spokane, Washington, in a working-class Irish Catholic family. His father had been a bookkeeper, his mother a homemaker who taught him that you helped people when they needed help, regardless of the cost. That upbringing had stayed with him through all the fame, all the success, all the years of being America's most beloved crooner. And right now, he was watching a man's life end in real time. Bing set down his fork. His hands were steady, but his mind was racing. He had no illusions about who these men were or what they were capable of. Interfering in mob business was a death sentence. Everyone knew that, yet somehow his legs were already moving, carrying him across the 10 feet of carpet that separated him from table 7. The 2 enforcers noticed him first. Their conversation stopped mid-sentence, their eyes locking onto this tall, lean man in an expensive suit walking directly toward them. One of them reached inside his jacket. "Gentlemen," Bing said, his voice carrying that smooth, conversational tone that had made him famous. "I don't mean to intrude, but it's gotten a bit loud over here, and I was wondering." He paused, letting a small smile cross his face. "Would it bother you if I sang a song?" The question was so unexpected, so completely absurd in the context of what was happening, that all three men at the table simply stared at him. The entire section of the nightclub had now gone completely silent. Even the band, sensing something unusual, had trailed off into silence. One of the enforcers, a man with slicked back hair and a scar running down his left cheek, spoke first. "Do you know who we are?" "I don't," Bing replied honestly. "But I know who I am, and I'm a man who doesn't like to see another man in distress." He glanced at Tommy, whose face had gone pale, especially not when that man clearly needs a moment to breathe. The second enforcer stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. He was taller than Bing, broader in the shoulders, with the kind of face that had seen and done things that kept people awake at night. "You're Bing Crosby." "I am." "You should sit back down, Mr. Crosby. This doesn't concern you." Bing didn't move. "You're right, it doesn't. But I'm here, and you're here, and everyone in this room is watching to see what happens next." He gestured to the crowd, many of whom were now openly staring. "So how about we give them something worth watching?" The enforcer with the scar leaned back in his chair, studying Bing with an expression that was hard to read. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled. "You've got guts, Mr. Crosby. I'll give you that, but guts don't stop bullets." "No," Bing agreed. "But music sometimes stops worse things." There was a long moment of silence. Then the enforcer nodded slowly. "One song. Then you walk away and forget you saw anything here tonight." Bing nodded. "One song." He turned to the bandleader, who was watching this entire exchange with wide eyes. "Do you know Ave Maria?" The bandleader's expression changed immediately. Ave Maria wasn't a nightclub song. It was a hymn, something you heard in church, at weddings, at funerals. The kind of song that reminded Italian men of their mothers, their grandmothers, Sunday mornings in Brooklyn churches filled with incense and candlelight. The bandleader nodded slowly, reverently. "Good," Bing said quietly. "Let's remind these gentlemen what's sacred." What happened next became one of those moments that people who were there would talk about for the rest of their lives. Bing Crosby, without a microphone, without a stage, standing between a terrified man and his executioners, began to sing Ave Maria, Grazia Plena. His voice filled the Copacabana with the sacred Latin hymn. The opening notes seemed to transform the entire space. The nightclub, with all its glamour and sin, suddenly felt like something else entirely, something holy. The two enforcers watched him, their expressions shifting. The one with the scar, his hand still inside his jacket where his gun rested, slowly withdrew it, empty. His eyes had gone distant, as if the song had carried him somewhere else, somewhere safer, somewhere that smelled like his mother's kitchen on Sunday mornings, where she hummed the same melody while making pasta. Maria, Grazia Plena, Maria, Grazia Plena. Tommy sat frozen, tears now streaming down his face. And around the room, patrons who moments ago had been pretending not to notice were now completely captivated. Several women were crying. Men who hadn't been to church in decades found their lips moving with the familiar Latin words. The taller enforcer, the one who had stood to intimidate Bing, slowly sat back down. His face had changed. The hardness was still there, but something else had crept in. Memory, longing, perhaps regret. Ave, Ave Dominus, Dominus tecum. As Bing sang, something remarkable happened. The tension that had been strangling the room began to dissipate. Not quickly, but gradually, like ice melting in spring. The sacred words, sung in Bing's perfect, resonant voice, seemed to remind everyone in that room of who they were beneath the suits, beneath the personas, beneath the violence. When Bing finished, holding the final note with perfect control before letting it fade into silence, the entire nightclub remained quiet for a long moment. Then, slowly, applause began. But it wasn't the usual nightclub applause. It was respectful, almost reverent. Several people were openly weeping. But Bing wasn't looking at the crowd. He was looking at the two enforcers. The one with the scar stood up, buttoning his jacket carefully. His eyes were red, though whether from anger or emotion, it was impossible to tell. He walked over to Bing and stood close enough that only Bing could hear his next words. "My mother," he said quietly, his voice thick, "sang that to me every night before bed. Every single night until I was 15 and thought I was too tough to need it." He paused, his jaw working. "She died last year. I hadn't thought about that song I hadn't let myself think about it." Bing said nothing, just held the man's gaze with compassion. The enforcer cleared his throat. "Mr. Costello is going to hear about this. And when he does, I honestly don't know if he's going to want to shake your hand or break your legs." He glanced back at Tommy. "1 week. You get 1 week. But if you're not square by then, there's no song in the world that's going to help you." He looked back at Bing, and for just a moment, the hardness in his face cracked completely. "Thank you," he whispered, "for reminding me." Then he straightened, the enforcer's mask sliding back into place. "And you, Mr. Crosby, you just used up all your luck in New York. Don't ever put yourself in the middle of business again." With that, the two enforcers walked out of the Copacabana, leaving Tommy slumped in his chair, still crying. Bing walked back to his table, sat down, and picked up his fork as if nothing had happened. His veal was cold now, but he ate it anyway, his hands completely steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. What Bing didn't know was that Jules Podale, the Copa's owner, had been watching the entire scene from the bar. Podale had connections that ran deep into the underworld, and he immediately got word to Frank Costello about what had transpired. Costello's response surprised everyone. "The singer sang Ave Maria?" he asked. When told yes, Costello was quiet for a long moment. "My mother loved that song, sang it every morning." "Then, tell our boys to leave him alone, and tell Tommy he's got his week." But only because Bing Crosby showed more respect for our traditions than Tommy ever did. 3 days later, Bing received a package at his hotel. Inside was a simple note: "Thank you for the song. My son graduated yesterday. I'll never forget what you did, Tommy." Wrapped in the note was a small silver medal of Saint Christopher, the patron saint of travelers. A prayer for safe journeys. But the story didn't end there. Word of what Bing had done spread through New York's underworld like wildfire. Bing Crosby, America's sweetheart, had walked up to Frank Costello's enforcers and stopped a hit with nothing but his voice, his courage, and his respect for Italian tradition. From that night forward, Bing had a peculiar reputation in certain circles. He was protected, not because he'd asked for protection, but because the mob respected what he'd done. He'd shown courage without disrespect, compassion without judgment, and most importantly, he'd honored the sacred music that connected these hard men to their mothers, their childhoods, their lost innocence. The enforcer with the scar, whose real name was Salvatore Giordano, was found 3 months later at his mother's grave in Brooklyn, weeping. A priest who witnessed it said Sal was singing softly, Ave Maria. 6 months after that, Sal quietly retired from the life and opened a small restaurant in Queens. He never spoke publicly about why he left, but he kept a photograph on his restaurant wall, a signed picture of Bing Crosby with a simple inscription, "For Sal, may music always find you." BC. Years later, a retired mobster named Charlie, the Blade Torino, gave an interview to a journalist researching the era. When asked about Bing Crosby, Torino smiled. "That night at the Copa? I was there. I saw the whole thing. Bing walked up to 2 of the toughest guys in New York and made them cry with a church song. You know what that takes? That takes a kind of courage that most soldiers don't have. Because he knew what could happen and he did it anyway. But more than that, he knew which song to sing. He could have sung anything, but he chose the song that would touch their souls. That's wisdom. We respected that. Hell, we still respect that." The incident at the Copacabana became one of those stories that exists in the gray area between confirmed history and urban legend. There's no official record, no police report, no newspaper article. But if you talk to anyone who worked in New York's nightlife scene in the late 1940s, they'll tell you they heard about it. Some claim they were there. Others say they heard it from someone who was. What we do know for certain is that Bing Crosby continued to perform in New York without incident for the rest of his career. And we know that his willingness to stand up for others, combined with his deep respect for the cultures and traditions of the people he encountered, became part of his legacy. The 5 words Bing said that night, "Would it bother you if I sang?" weren't threatening. They weren't aggressive. They were simply an invitation to choose a different path. And the song he chose, Ave Maria, wasn't just beautiful music. It was a bridge back to humanity for men who'd traveled far from it. Bing Crosby never spoke publicly about what happened at the Copacabana on March 18, 1947. When asked about his experiences performing in clubs with colorful clientele, he would simply smile and say, "I sang for everyone who wanted to listen. And sometimes, the people who needed music most were the ones you'd least expect. You just have to know which song they need to hear." Tommy, the man whose life was saved that night, disappeared from the historical record. But somewhere in New York, a man graduated college in the spring of 1947, completely unaware that his father was supposed to have been killed 3 days before the ceremony, and that he lived only because Bing Crosby believed that a sacred hymn could remind killers of their mothers, and in doing so, stop a bullet. If this incredible story of courage and the power of music moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs to hear about standing up for what's right, even when it's dangerous. Have you ever witnessed someone show courage in an impossible situation? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to hit that notification bell for more untold stories from music's golden age.